now got a whole jumble of points here to make. Let me just begin by saying, raising the, you said about capitalism, class struggle, crises. So very quickly, I would say, maybe one day we should talk about capitalism and its crises, because I have a neat little table and we could just talk about that, because explaining that would be itself quite an interesting thing. But I think of capitalism generating crises both in its core realms of value production and the realization of that value, but then also in a number of other realms that are indispensable to the existence of capitalism, namely money, credit, state, interstate relations, and of course the relation between any capitalist economy and the environment. And we can go through all of them, because all of these become sources of crises, and crises take two different forms. They take forms having to do with exploitation, that is interclass relations, what I call a vertical contradictions, and horizontal contradictions having to do with relations among capitalist and between capitalist countries. But leave that aside for now. But it is really interesting. And so we can talk about all sorts of crises, from, tendency of rate of profit to fall, demand, all the way up to environmental and ecological crises. But precisely because capitalism is crisis prone, in fact, it's not just about it. It tends to generate not just class struggle, which of course it generates, but it also generates international struggle. It generates a struggle between the dominant countries that want to retain their dominance, want to retain their imperial capacities, and those countries that are capable and able and willing to resist. And that has historically included capitalist countries. But what we have also seen is that starting in 1917, the socialist challenge has been the most powerful. And what does that tell you? And what does that tell you? In one sense, what that tells you is that capitalism, because it requires it can only give economic development to a core of the world, a capitalist world, which then must dominate the rest of the world, the periphery of the capitalist economy, if we may use world systems terminology, keep it in a subordinated position so that they can continue to have their wealth, etc. Because of that, much of the periphery has actually no serious investment in capitalism, unless people are really masochistic and they think that they have to, subordinate themselves to the welfare of other people. No, they don't think so. So historically, that's why capitalism has seen a continuing, unending series of anti-capitalist revolutions occurring not in the core, where some people thought capitalist revolutions against capitalism would first occur, but precisely in the periphery. And I think also as a result of this, and again, this is completely along a part of a Marxist analysis. If you think about it, for after 300 years, or however long you think capitalism's been in existence, what does capital have to show for itself? That its core consists of nothing much more than the original imperialist core that already existed in 1914, before we got into the 30 years crisis. So in a sense, it's barely expanded since then. And what does that tell you? It tells you that what capitalism has to offer to the rest of the world, to the world outside the core imperialist countries, is so shoddy that there is never going to be any cessation to revolts against capitalism. I should also say one other thing alongside this. If you think about it, if some of you will have read the manifesto. The manifesto was the Communist Manifesto, I mean. The Communist Manifesto was written in 1848. In 1848, capitalism was only beginning to get going. Right? The number of workers in Europe would have probably been less than 1 million or something. So, and yet Marx and Engels were arguing, essentially, or let me rephrase that, yet the manifesto was a call to end capitalism. Essentially, as we put it in the manifesto, to smother it in its European cradle. This idea that some Marxists have, that somehow we have to all wait until capitalism has spread all over the world and develop the productive forces all over the world, and only then we can have a worldwide socialist revolution. This is rubbish. It's never, though capitalism is not able to develop the forces of production, even in its homeland these days, where it is languishing in a financialized form that has left the productive economy quite debilitated. So it's not even able to do it in its homelands. It's not going to do it in the peripheries. In the peripheries, the only way in which you can have a reasonable development, which is reasonably just, etc., is to follow some kind of socialistic path. And in many ways, China is a decent model for many countries. It's not a model. I should perhaps say model, but the Chinese example should treat people a great deal. So those were at least some of the points that I felt I should make about this, because to come back to Ukraine, essentially, this is a war between as I say, those countries that have thrown in their lot with a decaying, financialized, neoliberal American leadership, and the rest of the world. And by the way, the more this wears on, we are also going to see something else. Already you see in the French elections, in the different pressures that is pulling Olaf Scholz one way and another way, that actually the much trumpeted unity of NATO, allegedly, the claim that they have all somehow come together to impose sanctions on Russia, is complete fiction. Each country is imposing the sanctions that are convenient to them. Gas is still flowing from Russia to Europe through pipelines in Ukraine. So in that sense, again, I think, Danny, you were saying earlier, and I'll end my remarks for now here, but you were saying earlier that, capitalism itself is getting incoherent. I think this is something we have to take very seriously. The idea that somehow the Americans have a plan that they're pursuing. No, I think the Americans have some sort of a memory of a plan. But even in the United States, different elements of capitalism are pulling in different directions. So I would say that capitalism is also increasingly incoherent.